Hello, ladies and gentlemen, friends and neighbors. It is August 17, year 2025. The time 4 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time Zone. And I'm your host, Professor Hamamoto. Thank you very much for joining me this afternoon or this evening, wherever you are in the world. I am, as you know, the up and coming YouTube celebrity of all. And I will be reminding you at the outset to please subscribe to push me over the 60,000 subscriber level en route to 100,000. And today I have prepared for you, thinking people, and I distinguish you. That's why my subscription level, I suspect, is so small compared to these other channels. Your viewing here tells me that you're more of the thinking people than the ones who are looking at these issues from a sheer entertainment perspective, right? Or voyeuristic. Of course, the two are not distinguishable at times, right? So this is how I'm going to be conducting today's talk in dealing with someone who's probably the most schlocky film directors of any note that have made a huge impact on American culture or culture of the English speaking world, let's say. And I believe he also has a fairly large following in such cinema literate societies as France. He supposedly was one of the youngest directors ever to be feted, to be celebrated at the world renowned Cinémathèque Française. And that's where the cinephiles go to analyze and sit and watch and dissect and critique specialty movies, genre movies, right? If you've studied film history or criticism, then you will know about Henri Langlois, and you'll know about François Truffaut and the whole French New Wave that supposedly cut their teeth on watching American film noir, as they called it, that they kept hidden away from the German occupiers during World War II. And they emerged magically in the 1950s with this revolutionary wave, the new wave, Nouvelle Vague, the new wave of cinema. And as I will be stressing in this talk from time to time, repeatedly, to the point where you're saying, okay, we got it, we understand, but I need to repeat this. These movements are not organic necessarily. They might start out as organic, but if they begin to gain traction, then there are nefarious interests, let's call it, that want to get a piece of it. They want to guide it. They definitely want to make money off of it. But at the level we're talking about, these organizations want to maintain ideological control, behavioral control, to the point where they can manufacture our very sensorium, our emotional makeup. And we're going to be talking about the deep psychology that is at play in films that are produced specifically by Roger Corman. I'm going to try to stick to him and stick to a certain subset of the Roger Corman oeuvre, that is body of work. I'll try to do that as best I can. I'm going to specifically focus on his Nurses trilogy. There are actually more than three of them, but they call it the Nurses trilogy. I guess they were the ones that he was immediately involved with, but there are a couple of other ones that Roger Corman has had a hand in. So let me first unpack partially what I mean by the title of this talk, Roger Corman and the Industrial Engineering of Social Psychopathy. That's a mouthful. And of course, that's going to turn off a lot of people. Maybe that's why I have so few subscriptions. I'm not putting any clickbait in here. Or I should say naked nurses galore. Put that in the headline and people would be flocking to this channel, but then they're going to get mad because, I'm not really delivering on the goods like Roger Corman. I mean, if you're going to pay, back then it was probably $1 to get into a Roger Corman movie, you want to see some tits. You want to see some titties, especially in his movies of the late 60s and through the 70s. You want to see some ass. TNA, it's called. You want to see pretty young women's. And of course, you want to see some violence, lots of aggression, explosions, havoc, mayhem. That's part of the formula. And of course, if you are a cinephile or you were in film studies and you took a course there, or maybe you even have a degree in so-called film studies, you're going to think Roger Corman is right up there with Kurosawa Akira, right? Even though he's a schlockmeister, he doesn't deny it, right? The book that he co-authored, so he couldn't even do it himself. He had a co-author. His name's Jim Jerome. Okay, it's with the book itself is How I Made 100 Movies in Hollywood and Never Lost a Dime. Okay, this was published in 1998. It was a few years earlier, but this is a reprint edition. It's still in print. I recommend it to you if you don't even have to be a film specialist. You can just be interested in this particular era, or you might be interested in making movies. There's a little bit of how-to in financing movies here. So there's something for everybody in this particular talk. All right. Now, what these cinephiles, these so-called film theorists that take themselves so darn seriously when they go to the academic film studies conferences or they give talks, and they're very serious. They're usually people who defected from the English department or comparative literature, and every once in a while there'll be people who are slumming from sociology or history or something, but they take their charge very seriously, and right down the line they think that Roger Corman is a genre genius. I'm throwing all these French terms out there because at a certain point they controlled what passed for literary theory, literary criticism. It was continental, meaning German, French, and a little bit of British cultural studies, right? So they kind of defined it by throwing in these terms like genre, which I will tell you now, I don't really think there's much of a difference between a genre and another. There are superficial differences where you can talk about, okay, this is a Western film with a capital W, right? A cowboy movie, shoot 'em up, bang, bang. This is a detective film, and there's a subgenre. I've alluded to it already, film noir. Right, there's the romantic comedy. These are all genres. You know the formula. They're so ingrained as part of our storytelling heritage. But one of the main points I'm going to be making here is that in the filmmaking industry, the professional filmmaking industry, because there's a whole amateur range of filmmaking, which I'm not going to get into right now. I don't know if I ever will, because it's very, very dark. It's very, very ugly. And I think a lot of it does cross over into the recognized film industry. That's why I don't really separate the genres from one another. I'll give you a concrete example. I'm speaking a little bit too abstractly here. I think there's a lot of crossover and a lot of congruence between what Roger Corman was doing with his exploitation movies. That's what he calls it. That's what they call it. I'm just using that term exploitation for as a shorthand. Okay. But I think there's a lot of crossover, congruence, or overlap between the hardcore porno business on the other side of the hill out in the San Fernando Valley of Los Angeles County and what Roger Corman was doing. I think there was a lot of back and forth. I think there were a lot of business interests, money people who were investing in this. And I think there were intelligence organizations that control it all, which brings me to one of the primary points that I want to make here, that your cinephiles, your cineasts, your so-called film theorists won't go. And that is, I'm arguing that there is a strong possibility that Roger Corman himself is connected to the military industrial horror complex. That's in the description here. And he's engineering it. He engineered it on an industrial scale. He either directed himself or produced or invested in, well over 150, maybe 200 movies. I don't know what the count is. If you want some details, because I know there's always some nitpickers here, just look at one of the many books that have been written on Roger Corman, articles that you can get a good count. Here's one that's called The Cinematography of Roger Corman. You can get a whole filmography if that's what you're interested in. But I'm less interested in his total output. I'm just interested in his role, his function within what I've talked about in previous presentations on the Professor Hamamoto channel over the past 5 years, of what I've been referring to as social psychopathy. And you notice I say social psychopathy because even within the field of psychology or psychotherapy or psychiatry or the social sciences, psychopathy is viewed as a standalone. I'm saying psychopathy is rooted in the social. Psychopathy is rooted in the historical. Psychopathy, in the case of Roger Corman, is rooted in the violence and the aggression, the perpetual, non-stop bloodletting of American military culture, society, and economy. Let me provide you some specifics to help bolster my assertion. By the way, I'm taking for granted that you know, at least to some degree, the name Roger Corman, and you know that he tutored in a certain sense or invested in, that is, ponied up money or gave assignments to such recognized auteurs. Again, we're using the French film theory language. Auteurs, author, literally, but it means in the cinema, these people supposedly have a distinct style, visually, aesthetically, themes and related aspects that you can say, well, that is a Scorsese film. And indeed, he helped tutor Martin Scorsese, who went, as everybody knows, to New York University, right? And that's one of the three main film schools that where most of these characters in America and internationally now come from: NYU, USC, UCLA. And Roger Corman certainly knew that. That's where he went for his talent pool, so that he could willingly, because it's these young talented artists, actors, writers, directors, sound people, you name it, whoever wanted to break in the film, they allowed themselves to say, please exploit me, underpay me, because I'm going to go on to become Jack Nicholson. right? And that's another person. I didn't mention his name just at random. Jack Nicholson himself will gladly admit that because of Roger Corman, he got a career. As dark as it is, Jack Nicholson comes out of that school, quote unquote. And that's one of the reasons why Roger Corman gets so much attention amongst film historians and critics. And there are very few people that want to talk about, as I'm attempting to do today, to the dark side of the Roger Corman phenomenon. And when I say dark, I'm saying about as dark as you can get, which we will see. At least I'll give you a glimpse of it, because this is TubeView after all. I'm not going to be talking about some very, very, very heavy cases that will never be dealt with on, certainly not on YouTube, but in academic research or journalistic work. It's hinted at, but it's not really there. And I understand why. It's the same reason why the so-called Epstein files and all the material there has never been seen. It's not seen the light of day. I suspect there's some stuff in there that no one wants to watch, because you can't unsee the unspeakable once you've witnessed it. And that's the appeal to a certain narrow subset of humanity, if you want to call it that. They might be some non-human species, for all I know, who get off on it. And we're seeing manifestations of that all around us right now. Because if you've been watching me for the previous few weeks, I've been spending a pretty good amount of time talking about the Brian C. Kohberger case, which I'll allude to here, and other writers who have come to the fore to capitalize on the serial killer craze. Right, that's what we're involved with right now. Every time I look into TubeView, there's a new channel, usually run by a young woman who speaks with vocal fry, because that's their code word. It's sort of like a shibboleth, right? If you can speak with vocal fry and you're of a certain gender and age group, that means you can come in to the dark side. You're admitted into the special club of vocal fry. It's purposely ghoulish because that's what they are. These are ghouls, right? So don't confuse me with them. Don't conflate my efforts with theirs, because superficially they might bear resemblance, but I'm going much deeper than that. So anyway, Martin Scorsese, Jonathan Demme, Ron Howard. One of his first deals was courtesy of Roger Corman. You know, Ron Howard he's made all those great crossover hits. And I grew up with him watching the Andy Griffith Show on TV. He was little Opie Taylor. And Andy Griffith was Sheriff Griffin. Man, I hope I don't find out some weirdness that was going on with Andy Griffin, but I always thought he was kind of creepy. And I thought Don Knotts was pretty creepy too. The only person that seemed normal in that show was Aunt B. And maybe she was bent as well, so far as I know. So Joe Dante was a low-level technician at the beginning of his career before he started directing films like Goonies and other fight movies. John Sayles. This is right out of the book here. I'm not making this up. You can read it yourself. Who I respect as he's a progressive. He's kind of a bullshit type. John Sayles, I'm talking about, director. But I like Matewan. I like Brother from Another Planet. I've seen almost every single one of the John Sayles movies because I will admit I was a cinephile. I was a teenage cinephile. And as such, and the reason I'm mentioning that, not just to talk about myself like usual, some of you hate a yellow person talking about himself, right? But I'm just telling you that it's because that's why I didn't go see a lot of Roger Corman films in the drive-in theater when I was a teenager or a young adult when he was really hitting it, because I was a film snob. I didn't want to see no movies about naked nurses. I wanted to see them Nouvelle Vague. I wanted to see the foreign movies from France. I wanted to see them German movies, the German New Wave. I wanted to see Werner Herzog. I wanted to see the great cinema of Japan the second time through. And I say second time through because I grew up watching that when I was a child. Because in the old days of Los Angeles, there were enough Japanese-speaking people of the immigrant and second generation, my parents, for example, who could support Japanese language movies. They're dead now. Most of those Japanese language theaters like the Toho La Brea and the Kokusai, where I used to go with my parents because they wanted to see those movies. They grew up with these movies, watching them in Hawaii. There's a huge market. Just like in the subsequent decades, there was a huge market for Cantonese-speaking people for products coming out of Golden Harvest Productions or the Shaw Brothers out of Hong Kong, which we'll get to in a moment, because Roger Corman did have some contact with those characters over there in Yellow World, right? Most of you don't realize that Asia has a really very long history of cinema. The reason why you don't see it, and myself, I had to seek it out, and you think that Godzilla is the only movie that came out of Japan, is because the market in America was protected. Not just by trade rules and tariffs and all that, but by mafia type level protection. And you're not going to open up that type of stuff unless we, meaning the mafia, control that. Anyway, it's a related theme to this topic, but I don't want to get too far afield of that. But while I'm on the topic, I have no doubt that Roger Corman had some sort of connection with quote unquote organized crime, right? We know enough by now in 2025 that if you are in the entertainment business, film, music, theater, sports, you're connected. You're connected by definition. You don't get in otherwise. So why would Corman be exempt from that rule? It doesn't make any sense. But it only makes sense to these academic film theorists who have been growing up sitting in a darkened theater all their lives, playing with themselves by watching the Nurses trilogy and spinning all these elaborate theoretical frameworks on the auteur theory as it pertains to Roger Corman. But no, again, I'll tell you, he's connected. I'll spell it out more specifically. Francis Ford Coppola is another alum. He comes out from UCLA. And by the way, I taught at the UCLA School of Film, Television, and Theater for one solid academic year before they got rid of me. All right. I was there. I was teaching me tons of what they exploited me because they wanted to get their money's worth. And they used my name, by the way, in advertising their doctoral program in so-called critical studies. All right. I'm just telling you, I know you don't like to hear about yellow people, but I'm just telling you this to wrap your mind around the idea that I do have standing when I'm talking about this type of topic. I I've been studying it and living it from the inside out for all of my professional career. And I have to tell you that because I used to get flack from my colleagues in academia because I'm teaching film studies or whatever it is. There's a film studies program. And they asked me, they challenged me, well, have you ever taught film? I said, yeah, I was at the UCLA School of Film, Television, Theater, motherfucker. What have you done? You probably just read a book about film history. Okay, so I'm used to that sort of condescension. So I want to clarify that I've studied this up close and personal. And I've met some of these high level directors and producers through my dad, who I've told you before was connected to Mickey Cohen, who ran LA. You got it? I've been to Mickey Cohen's penthouse in Beverly Hills. My dad was a hustler. He was a Nice hustler. And he was a landscape contractor. He went to Berkeley. He went to the University of Hawaii to study landscape architecture. And he was doing all the homes out in Brentwood, out in Holmby Hills, Beverly Hills. I went on those jobs. I met a lot of these famous directors' homes. I was at Vic Morrow's home. I was at Fred Zinnemann. Do I have to go? Okay, I'm just tripping out here. Because when I'm reading about Roger Corman, I say, yeah, I know this world, but I know it from the standpoint of an insider who was outside. Because you know who you don't see in Roger Corman? You see black people, right? Because he wanted to get a little bit about that popularity of the 1960s and 70s. They were called blaxploitation movies. He wanted to put a little bit of that in there. He put some hippies in there, but there's no yellow people in his movies. And I think that was on purpose. He wanted to make sure that the yellow people stayed in Hong Kong and in China. And the film business is very much still like that. You do not see yellow people unless they're George Takei gay. Or it's made by a gay director of Crazy Rich Asians, right? That's in 2020s we're talking about, not Roger Corman time. And there were tons of people he could have helped along who were yellows. One of them's named Bob Chin, Chinn. Look him up. He was a graduate of the UCLA Film School, but he couldn't get no job because he was a Chinaman. Roger Corman could have hired him. So what did Bob Chin do? Instead, he made a classic porno movie called Candy Striped Nurses. And he did this long before Roger Corman went into his nurse trilogy. So you could say that the Yellow Man inspired Roger Corman. I've never met Bob Chin personally. He's still alive, by the way. And there's not a lot of material on him on TubeView. I've been hearing rumors for years that he was supposed to be working on a book, but I want to read that. This is Bob Chin. He worked very close to the Mitchell brothers up in San Francisco, Antioch, right? And they had theaters all over. And I think they even had a Mitchell brothers in Orange County, which used to be quite conservative back when I was growing up. Like I told you, the porn business and the mainstream and the exploitation bit, the drive-in theater movies, it's all the same. And I think a lot of those people are also crossing over into the dark web as well. That's just my suspicion. All right. Peter Bogdanovich, he made, I think his very first decently budget film was Targets. Right? That's about a sniper. And this preceded the DC Sniper. When was that? 1982? By like maybe 15 years or so. Yeah, I know the term you're thinking is predictive programming. I don't use that term. I call it industrial engineering. Do you understand that? I don't use the term serial killers. I call them lab leaks because I think Brian C. Koberger has a lot in common so far as the way he came up and Theodore Kaczynski, otherwise known as the Unabomber. I'll talk about that later. All right. So I'm about blurring these artificial categories that these supposed scholars and theorists have erected, which are only stifling insight and explanation. Or as that said in German, the term is verstehen, verstehen. That translates to understanding. We're trying to understand here. We're trying to get into the explanation, the why question. Your pop-up pundits are only spitting sensational information and factoids, but they don't really care or asking the questions of how these people are coming to be. Are they product of some sort of industrial engineering program? I'm not telling you anything new. You know all about MK Ultra, right? Do you think that really stopped when Annie Jacobson said, "Oh yeah, I wrote the book on it"? And aren't you glad that we aren't in that world anymore? Okay, so let's talk a little bit more specifically about Roger Corman on a biographical level, because I made some pretty grand claims here. And it behooves me to substantiate some of the sensational assertions that I have offered to you. Well, Roger Corman's father, his name was William Corman. He was a naval engineer. He served in World War I. And he had, I think it was probably after the war, he went to college, but not just any college. He went to Washington University in St. Louis. All right. Washington University is regarded as kind of like the Ivy League of the Midwest. It's an elite institution. You don't hear about it that much, but it's heavily involved with engineering, the post-war order in America and in the world. That's why I say Roger Corman is related to the industrial engineering of social psychopathy. That's his father, going back one generation at least. I'd like to find out about his grandparents' generation. They were probably German scientists, engineers type. You know, we'd have to check that. But the father was an influence, and he wanted his son, Roger, to go into engineering because it's a good field. It's solid even now, even though the IT companies are shedding, as they call it, tons of workers, engineers, especially for yellow people. That was always considered to be the safe profession. There is nothing safe in this regime that we're talking about. Anyway, he was a naval engineer in World War I. He went to, as I said, the School of Engineering, got a degree there, and he went into the burgeoning engineering center of the time. Detroit was kind of like the Silicon Valley of its day. They were in manufacturing, though. They were into heavy manufacturing. You know about automobiles, right? But they were doing aeronautics, anything manufactured. Detroit, at that point in time, before it was disinvested from, was sort of the capital where a young man with prospects like William Corman would go to in order to make a living. But even then came the Great Depression of 29-30. He got busted out. But by that point, he was middle-aged. He was having some heart problems, from what I understand. He decided, well, I'm going to quit my job and I'm going to move over to sunny California. So they moved from Detroit to not just anywhere in sunny California, but Beverly Hills. And Roger Corman himself went to Beverly Hills High School. And that's where all the movie people who aren't in private schools That's where they go to school. So he grew up amongst people who had a direct connection to they were their grandparents probably, the direct connection to the golden age of Hollywood, going to Beverly Hills High School. So his father worked as a consultant. Roger Corman was a math whiz, took all the science courses, brilliant individual, above average athletic talent, but he also had a desire. He was a budding desire to write. I think he was on the school newspaper, and he carried that interest when he went up to Stanford. I think the decision was made to choose between Caltech, which is nearby, it's in Pasadena, right, which is in LA County, or he can go further north and go to Stanford, which even then was an up and coming school of engineering. Now it's like one of the top in the world, but back then it was already an up and coming institution. So he went there to Stanford, and this is during World War II. He was too young to volunteer for the military. He was too young for the draft. So he went into the officer training program for the United States Navy. So this, in addition to his father's pre-existing engineering background, tells me that Roger Corman was already beginning to be integrated into the industrial engineering complex up at Stanford and as a major in the engineering department. And also as a prospective commissioned officer in the United States Navy. If he had successfully completed the United States Navy officer training, he would have graduated from Stanford. He graduated 1947. World War II was over by 45, right? He missed out on the Korean War for some reason. We'd have to ask, how come you didn't go to the Korean War? You were ripe for that, right? That's a big question mark. I'm not just nitpicking here. What was he doing instead? Maybe he was doing intelligence work, for the Navy. Because most of you know that the Navy has the largest intelligence network. Their black budget is not even considered separately by the U.S. Congress. It existed long before the CIA, the OSS, the FBI, the FB, and all of those. It's called the Office of Naval Intelligence. He doesn't talk about that. I'm just inferring from my own reading and my background and my own profiling, my own cultural forensics experience tells me that there's certain questions here that need to be answered to find out who Roger Corman really is. Is he the guy that made exploding movies, car movies, and TNA on drive-in theaters in the 60s? Yeah, drive-in theaters was an institution in American culture. There's still a few of them around. I looked it up, but it's pretty much dead. Speaking of dead, the mall theaters are dead. The shopping mall itself is dead, right? And I'm telling you, this is one of the reasons why his business, Roger Corman, his business model had to change along with the re-engineering of the American urban and suburban and post-urban landscape, just like the shopping malls. Alfred Taubman was one of the big developers there, right? People like Leslie Wexner and these other people in the rag trade, they moved wholesale into the area. But besides the retail stores, what do you associate going to the mall with? Going to the movies. You want to see some titties, some nurse movies with titties. Brought to you courtesy of Roger Corman. He had a whole formula. I'll show it to you in a moment. I have some video for you. Hang on. I got to go through the biographical particulars here to support my argument that Roger Corman possibly belonged to intelligence. You just think it's Jeffrey Epstein. He's one out of countless of them. And Roger, you already know, because I have an above average audience. I'm not just flattering you. I know. I can I I can read the comments, and I have a large Patreon group. I know that you're at the level that I appreciate and I value. But Roger, what was I going to say? Roger Corman is operating at that level himself. He knows this, not just because he went to Stanford, but he went to acting school for a couple of years. He understood the acting art. He wanted to learn writing. He did learn writing, and he did study it formally. He's just not an exploitation director. He's far more than that. He's a serious intellectual, a serious artist who was assigned to cater to a certain demographic in the post-war period and the counterculture period of the 60s and the 70s. He was going to guide it. He was going to nudge it into the direction that the Office of Naval Intelligence and the corporate America can handle it, can contain it, just like they do with the music business, just like they did with the theater, just like they did with academia. They captured it. We're in the process of taking it back. We're taking it all back. And it's never a fully won and a completed battle, but at least we know that there's a certain formula at play here when we talk about industrial engineering. Okay, so let me continue with the little bit of biography. He did a little bit of work at the University of Colorado. That's kind of a blank spot. I know they do a lot of mining engineering. The engineering motif appears over and over again. And what was Roger Corman doing as a film director, producer, investor, distributor, other than engineering the popular culture? Right? Your film theorists don't talk about it, and they think that's too crude of a way to put it. They want to put an aesthetic spin to it, but no, he was out there. Roger Corman was out there with a pick and an axe and with a protractor. Remember those? And a compass and laying it out methodically where his dollars were going to go to put something up on the screen that was saleable and was going to make him money. I think he also had other sources of money, which I'm not going to even speculate about here, right? We know that films are in the music business, because we just got through with the P. Diddy trial, right? We know that that whole world is a vehicle for making black money into clean money. You know what I'm saying? Right? So that's the film business. Right? I'd be a fool if I didn't suspect something going on here in this case. So at age 17, as I know, 43, in the middle of the war, he went to Stanford U. He got his degree in industrial engineering. That's why I cleverly put it in the title. Roger Corman has training, he has a degree in industrial engineering. This is not just some flight of fancy here. This is not just a metaphor. It's a literal truth. So we got the degree in 47. Now he washed out. Well, I would say washed out. He wasn't commissioned, I don't think, as an ensign. They kind of parted ways. They realized that, and he himself realized that he just wasn't cut out for the regimented Navy life, right? And you think that's a failure? No, not at all. Do you think that was the end of the Navy's relationship with Roger Corman? No, I don't think so. I think they had their hooks in him for the rest of his life. They just didn't put a uniform on him. They what they call a sheep dipped him. They said, okay, perhaps you're not going to be able to follow the rules and the code of conduct like that we'd like to see of one of our officers. So we're going to put you in the film business down. And we know some people down there. In fact, we own the studio, and we'll get you a low level job and see if you have any, if you have any talent and ambition to work. So that's what he did. He had a hookup and I think he started out as a messenger. And you think, well, what a lowly job. He graduated from a degree, with a degree in industrial engineering from Stanford in 1947. There weren't a lot of people like that walking around. You think that he'd be rolling in the dough in job offers. And he could have been an engineer. He held out as long as he could. He tried it for a couple of days and he quit and said, no, I'm not cut out for this. But again, he didn't wash out of the Navy as such. He didn't quit engineering as such. He just redirected his energies where there are opportunities to be had on both ends. The people who recognize him as a talented, aggressive, brilliant young man, and someone like him who wanted to write. He's an intellectual. And I'm not just saying that. After he was in a dead-end job he worked his way up from manager, and eventually he became a story analyst, right? They get all these scripts. Most of them are pieces of junk. He has to read them, and they say, well, maybe you want to take a look at this, or maybe you want to develop this, right? That's a story analyst, right? He's kind of a gopher, but he's in the business at least, right? But after doing that, he said, you know what? I still have some credit on my GI Bill. For those of you who don't know, if you're a veteran, you get benefits. It's called the GI. It was passed by Congress, GI Bill of Rights. So you can get a low interest loan on a house. They'll pay for your schooling up to a certain point, pay for your books, and it's like a paid sabbatical. So he said, okay, I'm going to take a year off from film. It's not that hard. I can jump back in. I know a lot of people now in the business. So we took off to guess where? Oxford University. Again, when I said he's an intellectual and he's a scholarly type guy. I mean, even his demeanor, people say he's like a preppy. He wears like button-down shirts. He's like someone that you would see walking around in Cambridge, England, or Massachusetts. Pick your choice. So he went to Oxford. He went to Balliol College on the GI Bill. And he talks about it here. I understand academic culture. I mean, I went through it, right? And in Britain, they have what's called a reader system. So you meet with the professor, usually at the beginning of the term, and then you talk about your interests. He gives you a bunch of readings, a bunch of books to go through. You read them on your own, and at the end of the term, you come back, you write a paper on it, you turn it back. That's all you do. You have the rest of the time is yours. You don't even have to go on any lectures, right? It's called the reader system. That's the British system. The German system is a seminar system where you meet once a week, and there's an autocratic professor who makes you bring in work and you share it in a round table, and he picks apart your work. And so it's two different models, but he was in the British model. He loved it because by this point he was older, right? He'd been around. He'd had a job. He was still pretty young. He went to college when he was only 17 years old. So the point is that while he was at Oxford, and he traveled around England as well, probably throughout Britain, as I assume. But he was reading his E.M. Forster, his D.H. Lawrence, his T.S. Eliot, right? All the great, studying them in England and Britain, right? But he says he knew at this early juncture that he wanted to be a writer. He was going to be a writer. He'd already claimed that space for himself. He wanted to be a producer. He wanted to be a director of motion pictures. But he also realized that he needed a background in the arts in order to be able to direct actors, work with directors, direct movies themselves, and write them. Right? So he had a plan and he realized them, right? Just because he made these TNA movies does not mean that he has his background, so he knows what he's doing. Okay. Now, where am I going with this? Right. My guess, and again, this is for you researchers to carry this forward in a truly critical biography or filmography of Roger Corman, not the bullshit film theories, film school stuff that I've read. I read most of these books on there, and half a dozen full-length studies on Roger Corman himself. They're okay, they're good. Don't get me wrong, but they're not putting forth this argument that I'm talking about, this industrial engineering argument that he belongs to intelligence, Roger Corman. By the way, I took a poll of my ex people. I have an ex account. I think with the one exception, they said he belongs to intelligence. I also polled my Patreon sponsors. I think with the exception of one, everybody agreed that, yeah, Corman probably belongs to intelligence. Remember that immortal phrase by Alexander Acosta regarding one Jeffrey Epstein? Yeah, you do. And there was one person who was kind of half and half. But for the most part, this argument seems to be plausible to the people that I've canvassed so far. So you mull it over. You don't have to agree with it. Just think about it. And then compare it to what you have read about, quote unquote, Hollywood as being the CIA, Mossad, Sudete, Chinese intelligence, all the intelligence organizations are vying for control in what we call Hollywood. The consciousness industry is Hans Magnus Enzensberger referred to it. We call it Hollywood, but they develop their industrial engineering, our behavior, our thoughts, our feelings, and our scares, our frights, our paranoias, our fears. It's the fear factory. So to finish up my point there, I think they're not just to study the great names in English language literature, but I think that's where Roger Corman was reached out to or was sent in to talk to people at MI. They had the old headquarters back in those days, I believe. It wasn't on the Thames as it is today. Or they could have met at a cafe. They could have, they're all Oxford men anyway, or Cambridge men. Right? They probably met at Balliol College. This is where the military intelligence guys, MI6, MI5 people come anyway. And they had a nice conversation. Says, what would you like to do with your life, young man? You're really talented. You have a degree in engineer from Stanford. We know a lot of people in common. Oh, you want to write? You want to be a director, film director? You want to be a producer? Right? They had that conversation. This is my guess, right? How do I know? Because some years later, or not long afterwards, there was a obscure failed writer by the name of Gene Roddenberry. He couldn't sell anything, but then he made a trip to merry old England, and he had a conversation with people, and they said, "Okay, I think you have something here that we can work with." And then he came back to America, and voila, Star Trek. And by the way, Gene Roddenberry was affiliated supposedly with the so-called Council of Nine. Look that up. I've talked about it in previous time. The Council of Nine. I don't know of any secret societies that Roger Corman might have been involved with, but this is a work in progress. I'm just throwing this out to a critical audience here so that we can attune ourselves to what he is really about, what these movies really represent. And what they represent, I'll get to in a moment. Now that I've finished up his biographical information. Okay, we're talking the timeline, so far as that's concerned. We're talking about the late 40s through the 50s. right? If you're an American in the post-war period, your dollar could go a long way. In Britain, he could travel to the continent. He spent a lot of time, well, a certain amount, not a huge amount of time. He never lived there, but he was in Paris. There were a lot of expatriate writers, Americans, there at the time because it was cheap. People like James Baldwin, you name it. You've heard the stories about Hemingway in the pre-war period, 1930s. Shakespeare and Son bookstore, Sylvia Beach, that whole era that we romanticize. Well, he was caught in the thrall of that, and he went there in the 50s, and we romanticize that because that was like the existentialist period, because something similar was going on in New York in the 1950s. So he was absorbing all this. I think he had a handshake deal with the people in MI. This is just my guess. And then he went back to LA and started his film business on a low budget. Now, the golden age of Hollywood was over. The old moguls from Central Europe, Samuel Goldfish, the Warner Brothers, all those characters, they were all immigrant Jews from Central Europe. They all kind of grew up around the same region, right? They never learned to speak English properly. They were part of the Sabbatean Frankist group that migrated to the U.S. that guided direction of American popular culture to the very day. All right. Corman's mother, by the way, is Roman Catholic, according to him. I don't know what his father, but he wasn't a Sabbatean Frankist. But doesn't matter. He had certain qualities and skill sets that could be used in a new film environment where the studios were already on the wane. They were going out. The studio system was pretty much over. Everybody was kind of a free agent. So he was able to kind of make it up, a new framework in producing movies and distributing them. Right? I'd have to go through the whole history of film. We don't have time to do that. It's in and of itself, it's fascinating, interesting, but I just can't get into it right now. But Corman was living it, and he was making all these low budget movies and making a profit at very nicely. So, okay, but I'm not so much interested in the profitability picture, the fact that he never lost a dime, with the exception of one movie, which was a sort of a civil rights statement that taught him never to make any movies that are making a social statement. Just put tits and ass up there and you'll just do fine. And puts a lot of young women's in there who are screaming and they're being menaced by these horrific looking guys carrying drills or knives, chasing them around through a house. You know, I'm watching these movies again and preparing for this talk, and I'm wondering, God, you know, I wonder if Brian C. Koberger or one of his imitators or his predecessors grew up watching these movies, because it follows very similar plot lines, as if they were scripted. That's why I call it industrial engineering. Do you see where I'm going with this? We're not just talking about Roger Corman alone. We're talking about a whole industrial engineered zeitgeist of all these decades here, where you have the rise of mass murder and serial killing. Okay, before I run out of time, let's take a look at the man himself. You probably would expect seeing some guy smoking a cheap cigar and talking out of the side of his mouth, but this is Roger Corman. Yeah, he loves it. Shooting Filipinos out. That guy, I don't know if you realize how close he is to it, because at a certain point in his career, early career, Roger Corman does go to Asia, and he does go into the most seedy parts of Asia in the, I guess, the late 50s or so. First, he had a deal with American International Pictures, which was run by a guy named Samuel Arkoff. Right, that's another story altogether. And they sent him to Australia to do some scouting for a picture, AIP. This is before Roger Corman went on his own with his own company, and to scout locations in Australia. But why Australia? Why not all these different locations down in LA? There's tons of them. He mentions them. They made a bunch of Western movies for something like 30, 40 years in LA, right? And again, I'm talking about these curious overseas trips that Roger Corman took. One was his education abroad at Oxford, and the second one was his tour of Asia, where he went to Singapore, he went to Japan, he went to Hong Kong, I believe. He went to Calcutta. He went to Rangoon, which he talks about as being the worst place on the face of the earth that anybody could ever experience. I've never been there, but I've heard people who told me they've been to places like this, and I get similar reports now. And that also is that parts of the world where this black forbidden type of cinema was being produced, which I'm not going to talk about in this session here. I don't think I'll ever talk about it on TubeView. I don't know if I'll even write about it. All right. But I think you know what I'm alluding to. Right. And there are articles on it. I think I'll forward the articles on this particular form of black cinema. You can only find it on the dark web right now, which I know nothing about. It's on Tor. You have to use a Tor operating system. Or it's exchanged person to person, but there's academic articles on it. I'll post those on my Patreon so you can read about it and research it on your own if you want to, right? This is what I'm alluding to when I'm saying there's all this crossover between the different types of film activity. All right, both amateur and professional. So when he was over there in Asia, he was seeing film used in its most abusive purpose. All right. And some of that aesthetic, as you saw in this little clip, made their way into his movies. And more recently, I gave a little bit of an allusion to this one Hollywood filmmaker who's the son. He committed suicide, by the way. He was Epstein in jail just recently down in Los Angeles. He's the son of the guy who ran the Miss America pageant, who had to resign because they found out some kind of disparaging comment he made about the women that he supposedly was representing in the beauty pageant. But his son was making movies featuring Asian women who were in bondage and being threatened by knives and being chased to the jungle. And he was married to one of them. She was a Chinese student. And she and her parents were both murdered and dismembered. They only found her body. They still haven't found her parents' bodies. Okay, this is recently. All right. So when I'm preparing for this talk, when I'm looking at the career of Roger Corman, and I'm looking at all the different vectors that seem to intersect, this is how I'm putting it together critically. And none of this is definitive. Hopefully you understand that. I'm presenting a new way of understanding the Roger Corman phenomenon as an industrial engineered product, engineering fear, especially as it targets women, young women, students, people such that would attend the University of Idaho, which we can't get enough of it on TubeU right now. There's all these experts, pop-up pundits with local fry, women in their 20s talking about Bryan Kohberger, and psychiatrists. These are older women, female, they're all women, including their former professors of Kohberger, or hybristophiles, hybristophilia. They love these guys. Where does that? There's a material root for all this, a material origin. It comes from this history of genocide. I mean, it's August. It's the anniversary of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, right? My Lai, on and on. Wounded Knee. The Philippine-American War, 1899. On and on. Okay, this is the history that makes its way into these fright movies. So let's take a look at another glimpse of the Roger Corman aesthetic, if you want to call it that. He made use of the so-called counterculture in the 60s. And by the way, he describes himself as a political liberal, pro-civil rights, pro-women's movement, pro-black, pro-Latino, pro-white, of course. I mean, but not pro-yellow. He doesn't include the yellow people. Again, he's saving that over there. But by the way, he did meet the Shah. I forgot to mention, when he was in Singapore, which is now, back then it was still trying to overcome the colonial legacy of Britain, because all this stuff is dealing with colonial occupation, genocide, you name it, slavery, bondage, servitude, prostitution, camp followers, you name it, the worst of all. But that's where he met the Shaw brothers, Run Shaw. These are the people that helped to introduce the Kung Fu movies that inspired a younger generation of wannabes like Quentin Tarantino, who got his film education in a video store in Manhattan Beach. He was a video store clerk. So we got to watch all these movies imported from Hong Kong that most of us don't get to see. I was watching them. I was watching Japanese films. As I told you, I had to seek them out. I'm talking about the average moviegoer. So he met Run Shaw, the Shaw brothers, and I don't know if you ever met Raymond Chow, who introduced Bruce Lee to the world. Because, Bruce Lee was a Chinese-American man. He was up for the lead role of Kung Fu. But who got it? David Carradine. Because they didn't want no full-blooded Chinaman beating up white mans. So they said, we'll get some guy who's a fake Chinaman, call him David Carradine. And that formula persists. They'll put a halfie in there like Keanu Reeves or Tom Cruise or whatever, but they will not put no straight-up yellow person in that role. So Bruce Lee became a star in Hong Kong. He's an American. He was born in the Chinese Hospital of San Francisco, which I've visited. It's not the same location, but he was born in San Francisco. There should be a plaque on that hospital. Bruce Lee was born here. But he had to go to Hong Kong to become an international star. That was through Raymond Chow with Golden Harvest Films. The reason why I'm telling you this is that from what I've read, I won't give you the source. I had to reorder the book. I don't know where it is in my library because I need to have the documentation. I remembered the book because it was such an important piece of information. This guy here, who was an OSS veteran, says that him and his group, when they were in Hong Kong, were responsible for financing all these Chinese, specifically Hong Kong martial arts productions. right? So I think that was part of the reason why Roger Corman was going there to meet these big time global producers, right? It was part of a global system of industrial engineering in which the media would play the central role in engineering fear, dependency, oppression amongst the general population with specific interest in terrorizing young women, nurses, and students. Any institution where there are a lot of bright, energetic, ambitious young women in one place institutionally, nursing school, hospitals, universities, right? What are we seeing now? What have we seen over the past several decades? All right. So I've gathered, I don't have time to go through it here, but I did gather some literature, academic literature on sexual fetishism and nursing. Why are nurses specifically fetishized sexually? I mean, I can guess and I can speculate, so can you, but I want to see what other people have come up with. I'll share some of those articles with you on my Patreon. Maybe you can write an essay on it. I'm not interested. I'm just saying that I've done my background work, my prep work, in trying to figure out the psychology of it. Right? For some people, apparently, they'll pay good money to see a whole series of films on nurses, produced, directed by Roger Corman. But I did, in preparing for this talk here, come across on TubeView just sort of a random clip. It looks like a real one of a 1968, just a very brief glimpse, a 1968 gathering, a real one, not a film representation of a gathering of candy stripers. Were any of you a candy striper? These are the young women or sometimes girls, teenagers who volunteer at the hospital because they want to be nurses when they grow up. They want to go to nursing school or they want to go to the medical. They want to become medical doctors or whatever. There's a candy stripe, or I don't know if it's still around, but I remember it was big when I was growing up. And there are all these movies about that fetishize candy stripers. One of them was directed by Bob Chin, who I alluded to earlier. There's a reason why I dropped his name, because I knew I was going to circle back into it. And I was going to circle back to the Nurses Trilogy by Roger Corman, whose job was to industrial engineer fear amongst post-feminist women in particular, or those who were entering in larger numbers into the professions, such as teaching, such as nursing, not so much engineering. That's still kind of lagging, but they're making a big push on STEM, right? Science, technology, engineering, mathematics. And then Roger Corman would find women to direct these movies, to write them, so that he would evade any sort of accusation of being a sexist pig. So where did these ideas come from? I think it came from this sort of coterie of dirty old men who like little teenage girls in candy stripe outfits. Here's a clip. Maybe I'm reading more into it than I should. You tell me. I'll just play the clip. You can find it on TubeView if you want to review it again. I'm running out of time, so let's play this little featurette. By the way, I want to thank my patrons for your support. I was able to buy a 2 DVD disc set of the Nurses series by Roger Corman. And on the DVD set were some featurettes, mini documentaries on Roger Corman. And I'll play one right now. Not all of it, just part of it. This one's titled Paging Dr. Corman.
Before I formed New World Pictures, I'd made a picture for American International called Bloody Mama. The picture was extremely successful.
He wanted to do another woman gangster picture for AIP, following on the great success of Bloody Mama. So I went looking for a woman gangster picture while Roger went off to the Philippines to set up what then became a partnership with Sergio Santiago that led to, I don't know how many films they made together.
The Big Dollhouse, the Big Bird, the Hot Box.
Julie was working with me as well as having just married me and did the research and came up with a book, Boxcar Bertha. I produced that and had Marty Scorsese come out from New York to do his first Hollywood film. And Julie was associate producer.
Roger had an idea to build a distribution company with kind of low-budget exploitation pictures that would build to such an extent that it could finance pictures that he directed.
We'd had success with our first film, The Student Nurses, which was directed by Stephanie Rothman. And I remember it was a big success.
Dr. Sutton is an extremely busy man, but he's taken this time to welcome you. Oh, one word of caution. If at any time he asks you any question,
ask if the rule about doctors dating student nurses can be repealed.
When I started New World, I had a very small amount of money, and I wanted to be very careful, as I always am anyway, but I wanted to be extremely careful with the first few films that New World got off to a good start.
Well, there's a quota on black doctors, you know. I think that's why they turned you down.
I thought it was because I was a woman.
I'd been aware that long ago there had been a couple of nurse films that had done very well in the low-budget field, but nobody had done one for at least 10 years.
As a patient, Domino's been a problem. I was hoping maybe you could talk to him for me.
Maybe.
Thank you.
This was, I think, in 1970. The revolution or semi-revolution of the 60s was still going on.
I understand you're in Vietnam.
Yeah.
I was very much interested in the feminist movement, and I wanted to tell it from the standpoint of the nurses, and this was a key point, that the nurses solved their own problems. Julie, of course, totally agreed, and she enforced that through the other nurses' pictures.
560.
Well, you get the formula. And then later on, because in keeping with using front people in order to get through regressive ideas about nurses being sexually exploited in a hospital setting, right? You espouse, and this is the technique that all these Hollywood quote unquote liberals spout. They're always advancing these supposed progressive causes because really they are politically, in truth, they're regressive. They are truly regressive. They're hiding behind a certain front. Now, maybe Roger Corman is, and his wife, Julie Corman, producer, are politically progressive. But the upshot is their movies are horrifically demeaning, I would argue, towards people, including the black people they supposedly represent, right? As nurses, as doctors in these, anyway, don't get me started on that. Now, the larger point I wanted to make is that the first movie in this series was done in 1971, and it was in 1966. I've talked about this book in previous talks. In 1966, Richard Speck broke into this dormitory of student nurses, most of whom were Filipinas, by the way. This is in 1966, and he killed 8 of them. Now, kindly professorial, intellectual, Ivy League Roger Corman doesn't allude to the mass slaughter of these women while they slept. This is decades before the Brian Koberger bloodletting, 1966, if you want to look it up. By the way, Hervey Cleckley, who I've talked about, was one of the expert testimony providers in this book. This is a book about psychiatry and madness and killing. So it's an important book. They tried to use the insanity plea to get Richard Speck off from this multiple murder. And Hervey Cleckley is the medical doctor, as you remember from my previous talks, who came up with this concept of the mask of sanity, that these individuals who commit these heinous crimes, these horrific, these violent crimes, could be people that you pass on the street and don't even notice. They wear the mask of what he calls sanity. This is Hervey Cleckley. Check out an earlier talk that I gave where I go through that classic book, The Mask. You can get it online, by the way, free. Get a PDF, Mask of Sanity, Hervey Cleckley. Read it. All right. Here, and we're going to conclude here. I'll come back after I show the clip. We're going to go back to 1966 and revisit a news piece on Richard Speck, who, as I told you before in a previous talk, he became a prison house bitch to mostly black prisoners. This is how Koberger is probably going to wind up. And he grew himself some boobs because he took some hormone shots and dressed up in women's underwear and lingerie, and he serviced them in prison until the day he died. That's Richard Speck. And he also wanted the government to pay for his sex change. This is back in 1966, ladies and gentlemen. So here's a clip from the local news, I think it's in Chicago, WGN, of this famous case that shocked America. We're no longer shocked. Now we're expected. Now we have all these hybristophilic women on Tubu talking about Brian Koberger with local fry.
Murders shocked and horrified the entire city, resulting in one of the largest manhunts.
Sorry.
For 2 days, the murders shocked and horrified the entire city, resulting in one of the largest manhunts in the city of Chicago. For 2 days, the suspect, later identified as Richard Speck, eluded police by holding up in a seedy West Madison flophouse. Fearing that capture was imminent, Speck slashed his wrist and arm, allegedly attempting suicide. Police later discovered blood-stained papers and clothes in room 584 of the Star Hotel. Speck was taken to Cook County Hospital, where an alert doctor noticed the tattoo emblazoned on his arm that read, "Born to Raise Hell," a tattoo which had been described earlier to police by the only surviving nurse, Corazon Amaral. The morning after the murders, Amaral was able to tell police what the world would soon know. When Chicagoans awoke that hot July morning, they received the horrible news that Richard Speck had killed 8 nurses in this apartment, taking them one by one from the bedroom, tying them with bed sheets, either strangling or stabbing them all. Only one nurse survived, Corazon Amaral. She hid under a bed and survived the entire ordeal. Later, to crawl out on this ledge and scream to the neighborhood, "They're all dead. All of my friends are dead. I'm the only one who's alive."
Without her identification and the description, chances are we'll probably still be working on it.
Jack Walinda was the first detective on the scene after the murders were reported. Now retired, he still remembers the gruesome scene like it.
Well, it's a long piece. You can find it on Tubu if you want to watch the more. There's other videos as well on this famous case. And notice that Roger Corman, I'm sure he knew about this case because part of his working method was to bring the headlines into his drive-in cheapo movies. And he knew about text and subtext. He knew he could do a movie but have a subterranean or subtextual meaning beneath it. And that is, it's okay, women, that you can go and be nurses, be doctors, go into teaching, be engineers, go out into the traditional male bastions. That's post-feminism, right? But if you do, Richard Speck's going to be waiting for you. Mr. Goodbar is going to be waiting. There's a famous case called the Goodbar murders. And that came out at the height of the so-called women's liberation movement as well. The book is called Looking for Mr. Goodbar by Judith Rossner, later made into a movie. Who, by the way, that was the debut of one Richard Gere. If you want to read about the Gere family, look at one of the more recent articles by Kirby Summers. She'll go through the whole genealogy there. But that was his first movie, I believe. His first movie. It was a cameo. All right. So not immediately after this hour and a half excursus on what we just thought was a filmmaker who did these cheesy movies that we watched in the drive-in theaters or the malls, eating popcorn. Maybe we can get cop a feel from the girl we were with, in the passion pit, because you're a teenager. The home is occupied by your parents. They're home watching TV. You want to be out in the drive-in theater or in the movies with your friends. You want to go see some Roger Corman movies. So they knew all this. The behavioral scientists, the industrial managers and engineers really had a firm grasp on how they were going to steer this cohort of young Americans into the future. So we can learn from this in 2025. Now we have new media. Now we have the dark web. Right. This was the foundational process, I'd say, that's leading us in today's Chamber of Horrors. All right. So I've given you a lot to mull over till next Sunday, and God willing, I'll be back with you next week. And make your comments below. Feel free to share your observations, and subscribe to my Patreon if you like, and I'll put some supplementary material on the Patreon articles that there's no way I could have gotten to them today, that nonetheless I found very helpful in understanding this covert war in the guise of liberal tolerance, feminism, pro-women, pro-black. That's really the war against these same groups. It's targeting them, controlling them. All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your attention. We'll see you next week. Bye.